We're going to use the building management system as the example for developing a communication diagram. We have worked on this example in class where we created a use case and a class diagram. So let's pick one use case, the submit request use case, for which we have already worked on a sequence diagram, and try to understand why we need a communication diagram and how to build one. So let's look at the class diagram and sequence diagram that we have already built. So we have all of the entity classes that we did before. And then when we tried looking at the UI mockups for submit request use case, we realized that login is done as a precondition. And once they've logged in, the tenant will be taken to the home interface where they would click on the submit new request option or button, and then they'll be taken to the request interface where they can type in the details of the request and hit submit. So we have the two boundary classes that we identified, the home UI and request UI, and then we need one control. Typically for one sequence diagram that depicts a scenario for a use case, we would use one control class. And then let's look at the sequence diagram. So when the tenant selects the option to create a new request on the home UI, that sends an open request to the request UI. Now the request UI is open, the tenant interacts with it by typing in all of the details, and when he hits submit is when the create new request message is sent, which is then passed on to the control, which sends the request to the request object. This request object models the maintenance request. And a developer knows to write code for this part, for this function here in this request object, to connect to the database and insert a record in the maintenance request table with the data that you get from the UI passed on to the control to the entity here. So now we have all of these objects interacting with one another. And in the class diagram, we have these objects just hanging in there, not connected to one another, right? So we have to figure out which of these objects are going to be talking to one another. And if at all they're going to be talking to one another, what's the navigability? What's the direction in which they're messaging, asking for services? So for that, we can look at this diagram and say that, oh, the home UI is talking to the request UI in this particular direction, right? So we can go to the class diagram and connect the home UI and request UI in that direction. So it is easy to do this by updating the class diagram based on the information from the sequence diagram for a small sequence diagram. But then let's say if we have like 50 objects here interacting with one another with several tens of messages, it becomes difficult to check every pair of objects that are in the sequence diagram and go to the class diagram and update the relationship. So that's when communication diagrams come in handy. So while sequence diagram is good at showing the order of events, the order in which messages are sent, communication diagram is better at showing coupling. Which two objects are talking to one another, and do we need to update the class diagram by showing a relationship between those classes? So to create one, you just need to right click on the sequence diagram here, add diagram, communication diagram, and it will automatically develop a communication diagram. The layout is going to look a little sort of in disarray, so we can clean that up a little bit. Now you'll notice that there are lots of messages showing up here that might be a bit confusing. So one other way to do this is I'm going to just delete this communication diagram and do this all over again. We know from the sequence diagram that when you send a message, that's a function call going to a particular function in this object, right? So the dotted arrow that's coming back is the return from that function, the return value from that function. So while it's intuitive to see the return messages in a sequence diagram, when you generate a communication diagram, the return messages tend to make the diagram a bit messy. So I'm going to just get rid of the return messages and see how the communication diagram looks like, so that we can figure out how to update our relationships in the class diagram. So we did that, and then now let's do the communication diagram again, and you'll see that it's a bit cleaner. So let's lay this out a little better. So you have the tenant actor here that's talking to two UIs, the home UI and the request UI, and both are going in that direction, right? And then you have the request UI talking to the request control. I'm going to make the arrows oblique so that you can see the direction of the arrow. And clean it up a little more. Okay, so now you can see from this that the actor is talking to these UIs in a particular direction, and the home UI is talking to the request UI in that direction. So you basically know the navigability and the relationships that you need to build into the class diagram. So home to request UI to request control to request. That's the kind of thing that we need to create in the class diagram. So I'm going to go here and look at the association and use a directed association from home UI to request UI, from request UI to request control, from request control to request. So that's what we got from our communication diagram. I'm just going to remove the role names here so it's cleaner. And we don't worry too much about multiplicity when you create relationships between boundary control and control and entity. So you can leave it as it is, or you can even just hide the labels. Um, so so we have the relationships between the boundaries and control and entity, and that's the reason why we need a communication diagram. If you think it is easier to just do this with a sequence diagram, that it's easy to check pairs of objects and then go to the class diagram and update it, that's great. If the sequence diagram starts getting bigger, that's when it's probably better to generate a communication diagram and then go to the class diagram to make the updates. So that's all about communication diagrams. So what I encourage you to do is pick a use case, update the class diagram, do a sequence diagram, and then generate a communication diagram, come back to the class diagram and make sure it's all consistent with one another.